Yep.
So, hello, welcome back to your Primary Care Network Development Programme short modules. And today we are in the second of our 7 series modules. And this one builds on the last, in fact, the last being building your personal presence, but focuses more on the skills and the mindset of influencing for change. So as you can see on the slide in front of you now, there's a whole range of modules to come. And I really encourage you to view as many of those as possible whenever they are available and whenever you can, so that you've got the benefit of as many of these different perspectives as possible. To say something first about influencing. Influencing is something, of course, you already do. You will already have an impact. You will already have created some change around you. It's just often we don't know that we're doing that. And that, of course, is the benefit of asking for feedback. But I'd really like to encourage you to go into this module recognizing that you're already influential. You already have impact. In fact, there's a great quotation by Alice Walker, which is very relevant to influence, although it's framed around power. And it's this, which is that most people don't know how powerful they are. They give up their power by not doing that. And I think that's a really, really pertinent point, because sometimes we don't influence because we don't think we can, we don't think we should, we don't think we have the right, we don't think we have the seniority, we don't think we have the authority. So what we're going to be looking at in this very, very brief module is, even if you currently think that, how can you influence for something that you care about? And influencing is, of course, the real characteristic of leadership. And I'd like to read you out a quotation that, in fact, I read this morning in a brilliant book called The Promises of Giants by a writer called John Amaechi, Amaechi, which is a recent publication. And he says this: leadership can be demonstrated from any level of any organization. It's accessible to anyone who is willing to invest effort and emotional energy. Anyone who's willing to take a proactive role in maximizing their influence to shape the world around them. I think there's so much in that quotation, because there's no doubt about it that change requires influence. There's no doubt about it that change requires ongoing influence. Influence isn't a moment, it's not a single conversation, it's not an act, it's much more, as we'll see from a definition I'll offer in a moment, of a process. So it's really important to recognize the truth of what he says about investing effort and emotional energy. And emotional energy and emotional intelligence are really critical for influencing well. So let's open up this conversation. And I'm recording this module, as you know, if you're watching it, but I'm also recording it with some colleagues involved. So occasionally over the course of this recording, I'm going to pause so that the colleagues that are participating actually have some time to talk in breakout rooms, but I'll always switch the recording back on when we're ready to roll again. And when I do pause the recording, I'd really encourage you to do the exercise wherever you are, because these modules make much more practical sense. And I think you can make much more immediate use of them if you do pause to reflect on the exercises that we'll be engaged in this afternoon together.
Yeah.
So what I want to encourage to begin with is for you to make this practical, for you to make this immediate, for you to make this applied. And let's locate this then in what it is that you want to influence, to change. In order to do that, I'm going to create some space in the recording and for our colleagues in the room to have a chat about these questions. So, who do you want to influence about what? Right now, where you are, where you're working, who do you want to influence and about what? And then, really important, but we often miss this, is how you'll know when you've done it, how you'll know you're being effective along the way, maybe. What are the indicators? What are the signs? What are the signals? And the third point is what gives you the right to do so. Now, before I open the breakout room, I'm going to say just a little bit more about some of the questions here. The first is, what actually do we mean by influence anyway? You know, it's a word we banter around, but we often don't seem to really think about what it is. So I'm going to offer you the Oxford English Dictionary definition of this, the great resource available to us all. And the Oxford English Dictionary definition is that influencing is a process that impacts another person's thoughts, feelings, and or behaviour. So it's a process that impacts another person's thoughts, feelings, and or behaviour. Now, of course, that can be people, it can be a group rather than an individual. A couple of things I want to draw out here. One is that influence, as I think I've already said, is a process. Now, what does that mean? That's really important. It's not just a pivotal moment. It's not just a defining event. There's unlikely to be one single act or move or conversation that will achieve what you want to achieve. And I think sometimes we set ourselves up on the assumption that if only I can say the right thing at the right time, in the right way, to the right person, I'll get things moving. And I really want to encourage you to think differently about that. You know, if it's a process, it's a question of what's the series of steps, what's the sequence of stages that you're going to engage in order to achieve what you want to achieve, to influence what you want to influence. That is why John Amechi talks about emotional energy. This is about patience. It's not about power. It's about persistence. It's not necessarily about a magical moment. The other thing to draw out there is that very frequently, and linking to the second bullet point, how you'll know what when you've done the influencing as well as you'd like to. We often wait until somebody's behaviour changes. We often wait to think, well, clearly my influence isn't working because they're not doing anything differently. They're not saying anything differently. But you never know the seed that you've sown, do you? And I think it was Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, who, when interviewed by a young journalist, was very, very clear in his response. And the young journalist said, Mr. Edison, surely now you're going to give up. You've tried to invent the light bulb 999 times, and that might be a bit extreme, but bear with me, I'm exaggerating the story. And he said, young man, you entirely misunderstand. I now know 999 ways not to achieve what is possible. And there is this point, isn't there, the power of persistence, but also not giving up too soon. You may, as Edison was, be much closer than you think. And you never know anyway the influence you're having, because influence doesn't just happen, as we've said, with the process. And you may well be shaping somebody's thoughts. You may well be encouraging them to feel differently. And if both of those are happening, behavior change will follow. If neither of those two things are happening, I think we all know that we might be convinced that something's a good idea, but not do anything about it. You know, behavior change always lags behind thinking differently and feeling differently. And we'll come back to that point later, because how we act at our most influential isn't then just about having a good argument. It's about how you make somebody care about the issue. And then the third thing, before I open breakout rooms, is to ask yourself the question, what gives you the right to influence on this issue with this person or with this group of people? You may feel that you don't have the position, the power in the hierarchy to influence. The truth is, if we sit back and think about the reality of PCNs and the integrated care systems that are the wider context of primary care networks, they are effective only to the extent that people work across organisational boundaries. And that usually means that we have to self-authorize rather than wait to be asked or wait to be given authority. It's about influencing beyond our authority. And anyway, your good idea, whatever that might be that you want to influence for, or your sense of purpose or frustration that something should and must be better to achieve improvements in patient care, actually is sufficient to give you the right to influence. If you care and if you can see a way forward, then I want to encourage you to think that gives you the right to do so. Future impact on improved patient care is much more powerful as a right to influence than any position or any role. So having said that, what I'd like to do now for the people that are with me is open a breakout room and ask you to spend just 8 minutes, let's say, chewing over these questions together. So who do you want to influence about what, how you'll know when you've done so, and what gives you the right to do so. And then I'll start the recording again when everybody's back in the room. So let me just pause the recording. So welcome back to the module from the breakout room if you're with me this afternoon, or maybe from a moment or two's reflection if you're looking at this recording in the freedom of your own home and time. So let's build on where we are. Hopefully you'll leave this reflection or this breakout conversation with a greater sense of who you want to influence and about what, how you'll know when you're doing it and have done so, and what gives you the right. That final point I really want to emphasize as being so important. You need to be convinced that you have the right, because as soon as you're challenged, as soon as you get any resistance, as soon as you get any kickback, if you do, to what you're seeking to influence, if you're not convinced that you have the authority and the legitimacy to influence for what it is you're influencing for, then you'll crumple. So convincing yourself, influencing yourself actually about your right to influence is probably one of the most important things that we forget to do. And I really want to encourage you to do that. So once you're clear about those things, let's then build from that place onwards and look at strategies. And there are two broad strategies. And this isn't an either or, I think it's probably a both and. It's just that we tend to think about what I'll describe as the direct approach to influencing much more than we think about the indirect approach to influencing. But actually, as I hope will become clear, both are really important. It's a little bit like the distinction between what happens on a theatre stage depends on what happens behind the theatre stage. What happens on the operating table depends on what happens around the operating table. And I think very, very frequently in influencing, we only plan and prepare and practice and focus in on what's happening on the stage and on the table rather than around, before and behind. So I'd like to bring both of these to life, but to start with direct, because that's where mostly we start. So first thing you might think of doing actually is a stakeholder map, a relationship map. So this is a very, very straightforward example, because it's very helpful to know the network of relationships around you. And sometimes we focus on those closest to us rather than those that are broadly around us. So this is one way of thinking about a stakeholder map, or a relationship map, as I think it's a friendlier term. So this is Liz, and around Liz she has, as you can see, Stephen, Farouk, Helen, etc. But what she's doing here is using different colours, whatever's available to you, or different lines to indicate good relationships. So there you can see that Sally, Joel, Stephen, Enya are good relationships. Okay relationships, so Farouk, Helen, Sanjay are okay relationship. Poor relationships or non-existent relationships, Matty, Mary, Fred. And then the thickness of the line is in relation to who needs to be influenced, who needs to be engaged in order to progress this particular influence agenda that you have. So you can see here that the distinction is a thin line, important, a thick line, really important. So Sally and Joel, good relationships, really important. So Liz has that going for her. Less fortunately, you can see that the poor non-existent relationships include Mary, Liz's new boss. So Liz would need to be thinking a couple of things, one of which I'll come back to later on. The first that I'll come back to later on is, where do you start with your influencing? Now, who here do you start with? Do you start with Mary? Do you start with Fred? Do you start with people who don't necessarily support the influencing intent that you have? Or do you start with people who do? What I'd like to encourage you to think about is finding people that you can directly, i.e. face-to-face, person-to-person, if it's a virtual environment, influence among a range of criteria. People who care about the issue that you care about, people who can make change happen. Now, that might be because they are experienced or well respected. It might be because they're senior, maybe because they have access to resources. But it's not enough just to influence people who care. You also need to influence people who can. And then the third category of people that need to be influenced are the more senior sponsors. Because so often in organizational change, great things don't happen because of a lack of senior sponsorship. Because senior colleagues get to hear about changing ideas too late, and may feel that it's too late for them to offer support. So you don't want to have made good progress and then suddenly find your great idea vetoed by somebody who you could simply have informed or asked for their sponsorship. So lots to think about here, and I think this is a really straightforward, accessible exercise to engage in, just to create your own relationship map. But then the question is, what do you say when you're sitting in front of an individual or a group who you're directly trying to influence? And this is where the thinking of a writer called William Bridges, who's written a great, small, a very readable, accessible book called Transitions, comes into play. Because he says it's important things. He says something that we mentioned earlier, but elaborates it. And the something that we mentioned earlier is that it's not enough to be convincing. It's not enough to write a compelling paper. It's not enough to have a logical and factual data bank to inform your influencing. That's important, but it's not enough. You know, you need to have a good case. You clearly need to have a good case. But he talks about the fact that the word emotion is a really important one, because if you untangle, if you unpick the word emotion, it's got motion in it, hasn't it? And when you think about it, nothing ever happens without emotion. People have to care in order to be able to change their behavior. And sometimes even that's not enough, William Bridges says. You know, we might care about, I don't know, getting ourselves fit, but does that mean we go to the gym? Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. So we can learn a lot about how we influence real change in other people's practice by understanding how we get ourselves to change. And really frequently, it's not enough to know you should. It's not enough to care about it. You need a plan. You need a disciplined, rigorous structure that makes it seem possible and accessible. And that's the basis of what he describes as a really important framework for communicating your case for change. So let's talk this through. And I'm going to then pause again to offer colleagues that are in the room with me a little bit of time to think how they might use this structure. But clearly it'll be useful to think about this after this short module as well. So he frames this around 4 statements. What I hope to achieve. You need to be able, he says, to enable people to imagine what you're describing. So Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a plan. He said, I had a dream. And he then articulated his dream. He made it possible to visualize. He made it possible to imagine. So how clearly are you helping your colleagues see what you're describing? This really matters for it to feel possible. So what I hope to achieve, or what we hope to achieve, the language is adaptable. Why this matters, the purpose. I don't know if you've come across a thinker called Simon Sinek, whose great TED talk is called start, how great leaders achieve change, and the essence of what he says is start with why. Normally we start with what, but we forget the why. And of course, the purpose isn't only as you see it, it's as you think the person you're trying to influence will see it. So why does this matter for them? This is what John Amachi talks about when he says emotional energy and emotional intelligence. It's translating why you think this matters to why it's significant for the person in front of you. So for example, with a new medical director, you might say, I know that you're concerned about quality. What I'm about to suggest is going to support quality improvement for patient outcomes. That might not be your main driver, but you know it's a priority for that person. And so you present it in support of a concern that that colleague has, or those colleagues have. Not because that's a falsehood, but just because you're making it easy for them to see the benefit to them. And then the final 2 points, both equally important, are how I plan to achieve this. You know, what are the steps that we need to go through to get this moving? Again, you know, people can be convinced, they can be energized, but they might not think that what you're suggesting is possible if you don't offer them a first couple of steps at the very least, often including resources. What resources is going to require, and where are you going to get that? And then the final thing, and his research finds that if there's anything that we forget when we're trying to influence the change, it's this. And the this is how you can help. What's your part in this? Now, what's your ask of the people that you're influencing? Are you asking them to get involved? Are you asking them to agree with you? Are you asking them to do something? I had a really interesting conversation earlier today that illustrated this very point, actually, not in health, in higher education, where the colleague I was talking to said, you know, I can't get anybody to do anything in this place. And I said, well, how do you end the conversations? And she said, I say to people, so can you go away and maybe reflect on this conversation? And I said, well, you're only asking people to reflect. You're not actually asking people to do anything. And she said, but I'm trying to be nice. And so we talked about, well, you can be nice, but you do need to be clear about what the request is. So let's see whether or not there's anything in this for you. Again, I'm going to pause the recording so that colleagues that are live here with me can think through what they see as the possibilities in this for them. It's not a practice, but you might just like to talk through, could you use this? How could you use this? And so that the question that I'll leave you to pause the recording around is the question I'll ask my colleagues on screen with me now to think about together, to have a go at using this framework to structure how you can communicate your case for change. So, you know, could you fit what you're wanting to influence into this framework? Could you see how that might work? That's the question that I'd like to ask you. All right, so again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the recording. So having had a think through, or actually a go at using this framework, a couple of things have come out of our conversation. I guess one of the most important is to reflect on the language of the influencing for engagement structure by talking not so much in terms of I, but in terms of we. And that's a conversation that we've had this afternoon with the participants that are here engaged in the module. So what we can achieve, why this matters for us, how we can achieve this, how we can all play our part, is a really interesting, I think, variation. The structure, though, is probably still important, not necessarily in that order. I think there is something about feel free with the order, but cover the territory, because often we forget to cover this same territory. So that's a focus on direct influence, what it is that works best when you're seeking to really engage a colleague or a group of colleagues through your person-to-person communication. But let's have a conversation to finish with about the indirect and what we mean by that. So the indirect question is, how do I decide who to influence first? You know, that relationship map, which I'll just show you again in a moment. And how do I build momentum once we've started to have a conversation about change? Because I think going back to the idea that influencing is a process, you do need to keep at it. Having said it once, having had one conversation, it's never going to be enough, or exceptionally, it's going to be enough. It's usually the case you need to come back round to rebuild, restate, reset, refocus. But there's another approach to thinking about this. And if I refer us back to our relationship map, the question here is who influences whom? So even if you don't have a good relationship with Mary, the question is who does have a good relationship with Mary? And it may well be that Sally has a great relationship with Mary. So what you would do indirectly is influence Sally, knowing that Sally, or asking Sally to talk to Mary. So I really want to encourage you to think, even if somebody on your relationship map is inaccessible, even if the change is potentially dependent on their support, it's still possible for you to access them through this networked approach to influence, through this web approach to influence. But the other thing that I think is important about this notion is the question about how do you start? And that's where a variation of this relationship map is what's called currently social network analysis. And very simply, what this is a heat map of an organization. What I mean by heat map is this, believe it or not, is a hierarchy. It's an organizational chart. This is the boss, and these are the direct reports. It's just not drawn like that, is it? Because the boss doesn't get that much informal contact. They get loads of formal contact, but not much informal contact. And what you're looking for here is the people who everybody goes to, the people that have loads of interaction with colleagues, because they're the people who will drop what you're seeking to achieve into a conversation and will mobilize others towards the idea that you want others to engage in. So the encouragement of this way of thinking is beautifully demonstrated by this diagram here, which is a true model of an organisation compared with another organisation, two trusts in the NHS, both of whom introduced lean quality improvement methodology. One of the trusts, interestingly, an outstanding trust, really made a difference to patient care and service outcomes with the lean methodology. The other didn't. And one way of diagnosing the difference that the group that were researching that same difference, which was Warwick Business School, identified was that the outstanding trust had very close-knitted networks, people who often interacted. They brought groups together frequently to compare and exchange practice. They talk about the work that they were doing. This trust only ever met formally and not very frequently. So I think there's a big message in this, which is that informal change, the behind the stage change, the round the operating theatre perspective on change. It's not only what you say directly, it's what you say indirectly, and the energy that you can mobilize through social connections and relationships. It's seeing organizations actually as networks, and primary care networks are actually networks. It's using those networks in order to create and foster change. And then the final perspective that I think springs from this very easily is don't put all your initial energy into trying to engage people who you anticipate will be quite resistant. There is always a natural viral, and it is a viral approach to change, which depends on the population. So very often we put all our effort into people who don't want to and won't ever say that that's a good idea, rather than starting with our early adopters, our first followers, because the really encouraging point about this is if you take the population of the people that you're trying to influence, what this suggests is if you can positively engage only 15 to 18% of that group of people, you will be mobilizing a movement. You'll be mobilizing movement because you'll have started a conversation with enough people to make change happen. Now, that's all we've got time for this afternoon, and there are loads of ideas in this short module. So before rushing off to do what you need to do next, I'd really like to encourage you just to slow down a moment and see how this might have influenced your thinking. So please do spend a few moments capturing what you're taking away from this short session. What are the ideas you like? What are the ideas you want to try? And then again, try to influence yourself by committing to something you'll do as a result. Is it that you'll do the relationship map? Is it that you'll use some aspects of the William Bridges framework? Is it that you want to find your first followers? Whatever works for you, I hope this short module has been practical and also given you a few ideas that you'd like to take away and put into your practice. Next time we meet, 12th of May, 4:15 to 5:15, we'll be talking about giving and receiving feedback. And if ever there was an act of influence, there you have it. So I'll look forward to seeing you and working with you then. Meanwhile, I hope this has been fruitful and really wish you well. Thank you for coming along.